The book of Judges. We began this message last week. We'll pick up on it this week. It's called Breakpoint. Breakpoint in itself is neither bad nor good. You can have a breakpoint that carries you lower. You can have a breakpoint that carries you higher. It is a point of change where something happens, something clicks, and you're different after that point. Chapter 7, verses 19 and 20. Gideon and 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets, broke their jars that were in their hands. The three companies blew the trumpets and smashed their jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hand the trumpets that they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." What's happening here? God has instructed Gideon on how he will defeat the Midianite army. Breakpoint moments always have a lead up. They never happen just instantly. There's always a lead up to it. This took place this very night when two guys were on top of Mount Gilboa and they were looking down upon the camp of the Midianites, 100,000 tents. There was acres of horses and camels and campfires that lit up the night. And God had told Gideon, you need to go down into their camp and hear what they're saying. So about the time everything settled down, these two men crept down into the camp, and they got there just in time to hear one soldier telling another, "I had a dream." He was shaken. Something tremendous had taken place. There was a realization by this soldier because of that dream and his friend. Suddenly they realized that God's call was on Gideon. So God's call was on Gideon. How did that take place? We found out last week that it was under the oak at Orpha. It was there that the angel appeared to Gideon as he was threshing wheat in a secret place because the Midianites would steal all of the crops. So he was hidden there. And it says in Judges chapter 6, verse 12, that the angel, as he appeared, said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And here he is, crouched down, threshing a little bit of wheat so that his family could have a little bit to eat. And the angel's calling him a mighty warrior. He said, "I'm not so sure that's true." Then in verse 13, it says, "But sir, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all of his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did he not bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us, put us into the hands of the Midians. That old kind of doubt hangs around. God's not going to be on time. God don't care anymore. God's not happy with us. God's punishing me. All of these things. We ask the question, why aren't we seeing as many miracles today as we did in the old days? Or even at the turn of the century? There's always that backward look. Yet when you look around today, faith in Christ is alive and strong. And it's living in hearts and lives all over. People are getting saved. 3 weeks ago, we had 3 people just give their lives to God. Everything, I'm just giving it to Him. It was awesome. Those are miracles. When we look at this, Gideon was looking back. There was no future. There was no hope. The angel knew exactly what to do. The angel just looked over at him. I don't know if you've ever had one of those looks, but it preaches a sermon to you. And that's exactly what was happening. It was like when Jesus looked at Simon Peter after he had denied him and after the rooster crowed. Suddenly Jesus just looked over and Simon was put in his place. He understood. He knew exactly what had happened. The angel's look was saying, you're the man. You're the one that's able to do this. 6:12, it says, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. You know, we can tackle anything when God's with us. He's here. He's with you. The signs that Gideon asked for of the Lord, they were not showing doubt because he wanted to make sure God's with me. So he says, you know, show me something. Give me some encouragement. Go get a sacrifice. They went and got a sacrifice. Put it on the rock. He put it on the rock. And suddenly fire came up and just consumed it. That's a pretty cool trick. That would have got my attention. And it did get his attention. But he says, look, there's 100,000 Midianites there. There's not many of us. If you want me to go battle them, I want to know you're going to be with me. So please don't get mad, but I've got a piece of wool here, and I'm going to lay it out on the ground, and if it be okay, in the morning, let the ground be wet and the wool be dry. God said, okay. He got up the next morning. The ground was wet with the dew, but the fleece was perfectly dry. So he said, God, oh, please don't get me mad at me. In the morning, would you reverse the order? Let the fleece be wet and the ground be dry. Next morning, he got 2 glasses of dew out of that thing and the ground was just as dry as it could be. Suddenly he knew God is with me. I've got this battle. So he said, tell me how you want it done. Gideon had to trust. If you're going to walk with God, if you're going to accomplish anything with God, you're going to have to trust Him. You'll trust Him before you have faith in Him. You cannot have faith without having trust. true service for God means that we will come in that moment of trust so that our faith will blossom. We will work with God. We'll work for God. Israel was in that place. Gideon had reached his breakpoint. He was broken because of the enslavement of Israel. So when God called him, told him that he was to deliver Israel from the hands of the Midianites, that was a breakpoint for this man named Gideon. It was time to step up or step back. It was time to fish or cut bait. It was his choice. It was his moment. It was a task that would fire the imagination of any man of faith and valor. But there was that lead up, and it was still going on. That great act of deliverance didn't just happen. There was a build up to it. It took more faith, more courage, more trust than Gideon had ever imagined that he had. Let me tell you something. God, when you give yourself to him, lock, stock, and barrel, he will take you places. You'll have to use more faith. You'll have to use more trust than you ever dreamed that you would have. And you'll sit back and say, I cannot imagine that. I don't know where that came from. But every time you overcome, every time you progress, you become stronger in faith. You become deeper in trust, so that the next obstacle will be easier than the last obstacle. Israel was not only enslaved, but they had been literally degraded. Their miserable predicament was God's punishment because they had slipped back into idolatry. Even Gideon's family, his own daddy, had went back into idolatry. He had reared up poles, groves, to false gods, to Baal and to Asheroth. And God said to him, go cut them down. Now, buddy, you better be trusted. Am I hearing right? You want me to go to my daddy's house and cut down his gods? The things that he's worshiping? Said yes. So Gideon prepares himself. He knows that the Midians are there, but he's got something he needs to do first. And he goes over and he cuts those down, and there's a long story connected with that. I don't have time. But there's a point there. When you're going to launch out for God, there's some things you have to take care of. You have to get your priorities straight. There's some hindrances in your own house that's going to have to be taken care of. And you're the one that's going to have to take care of it. And God will help you to do that. The courage that it took was of the highest order. It wasn't just a passing thing. The townspeople, they got upset. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to know, who did this? Evidently, Gideon's daddy knew who did it. Because the axes had been laid to those poles, to the groves. The fire had been built. The mob wanted to kill, and they called for Gideon, Jerubbaal, hey, send that rascal out. We're going to take care of him. And his dad said, no, if Baal's got any power, let him just contend for himself. Let Baal take care of it. He can plead for himself. That's what Jerubbaal means. Let Baal plead for himself. If you're going to make a mark for God, if you're going to be a witness for truth in this day and time, you're going to have to decide which way am I going to march. It's a break point. Am I going with God wholeheartedly, or am I going to play this game? A little cool, little warm. When service is going good, I can hoot and holler. When it's not going good, I can always text. You're going to have to decide. And it's very likely the first thing you have to do is get your house in order, get your heart in order, get your life in order. There's rooms in your heart. There's rooms in your life. There's rooms in your home that you've stubbornly kept out of sight. We've not let the light get into those places because those kind of places love darkness. They're secret places. First, you're going to have to put your heart right with God. You're going to have to let the light in on everything. Then God will use you as he sees fit. So Gideon, all of a sudden, hews down the false gods, puts everything in order, then he's ready. And he lifts the flag right after that and says, anybody that wants to fight for God, with God, you come on. And listen, 32,000 men flocked to him. 32,000 men from Israel came and stood by his side to march against the Midianite army. They heard what he did with the grove. They heard what he did with the poles that were set up to Asheroth. And 32,000 of them came. Because they knew that God had a plan. Gideon knew God had a plan, and it's going to work perfectly. Listen, God's not going to call you to do anything that he doesn't have a plan with to do it. And he'll lay it out for you. God looked over that little army that had been gathered there. And in Judges chapter 7, verse 2, God said those magic words, you got too many. Wait a minute. Well, 32,000, 100,000, no chariots, bunch of chariots. No horses, bunch of horses. Too many? You got too many. Gideon, cut it down. The first test by which Gideon was directed to reduce his army was the test of fear. That's a pretty strong test. So Gideon stood up in front of the men. And he took one long look at his army. And he said, fellas, come on with me. And he marched them back up on top of Mount Gilboa. All 32,000 of them. And he said, look down there. The valley of Jezreel was covered. That valley of Jezreel is also known as the valley of Armageddon. That little valley is the most fought over piece of real estate. All 32,000 of those Israeli soldiers looked down. They saw the 100,000 as they were stretched out. Judges 7:3 tells how he turned around and he says, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead and go back home. If you're scared, you can leave and go back. That was in keeping with the law. Whenever Israel went to war and the army was assembled, the officers were to say to their soldiers, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8, if any man is afraid or faint-hearted, let him go home so that his brothers will not become disheartened too. Fear, disheartenment is contagious. It would spread through the ranks. So God said, let them go if they want to go. Gideon was saying, I need all I can get. I'm short-handed now. They got us 3-1. And God said, yeah, but you got too many. Better to have a troop of 10 men full of courage than a regiment of 100 men where 90 out of the 100 are afraid. This reduction of Gideon's army has a bearing on the church also. Half believers, a man who fears the world more than he loves Jesus, they fill the ranks of the church. And whenever faith rises, we can do this. They're the ones that say, we can't do that. We've tried that before. It's a lost cause. And it'll cause the heart to melt if you're not careful. How many do you think took the invitation of Gideon to go back home and be with mama? 22,000 of the 32,000 packed their bags and went home. That left 10,000 with Gideon. What's an army of 10,000 going to do against an army of 100,000? They've got us outnumbered 10-1. That's not good odds. And God says, Gideon, too many. Because when I give them victory, they're going to brag about it. So we need to cut it down a little bit more. The first test was one of courage and fear. The second test is one of earnestness and zeal. So God told Gideon, march your army over to that brook. Then you'll know. You'll know what real thirst is. You'll know what it is to be dry and thirsty and hot. So the army started marching, and the day was baking. And by the time they got to the brook, they were famishing with thirst. I'm dying with thirst. They broke rank and ran. 9,700 out of the 10,000 laid down on their bellies, put their mouth and their face in the water, and they began to drink like a horse or a cow. They drank their fill. 300 of them kept their spear and their shield and knelt down and brought the water up with their hand and lapped it like a dog. The way of drinking showed an alertness, a heart for a cause. There's an enemy, and we need to be ready in case they try to attack. The other 9,700, by their way of drinking, they showed that they were just satisfying themselves. They wanted their temporary thirst quenched quickly. And they were more interested in drinking that water than they were meeting the foe. It told a story. It seemed like a strange ratio, 9,700 to 300. But still in the army of Jesus, the church, the number of those who support the services, engage in the work, witness, zealous for the honor and for the kingdom of God, we have the ratio. The hand lappers to the knee drinkers. There's a picture there. God's showing something. So the second test, a test of an indifference and carelessness. The army was cut down. Happens in the church also. But listen to me. Yet the army will march stronger and stronger against the foe because it's led by the Spirit of God. God's already preparing the battlefield. Even at that moment, these guys couldn't tell, but God knew. Okay, watch with me for just a second. What do you think Gideon thought at this moment? When God says that big group over there, that 9,700 men, send them home. 300, they can stay. 300 against 100,000. Not good odds. Las Vegas wouldn't give you any odds on that. They'd count you out. That little handful, what's going to happen? I think I can see him leaning on his sword as he stands on top of that cliff, overlooking the valley, down on that swarming Midianite and Amalekite, like grasshoppers just moving around all over down there. The smoke of their campfires just covering the horizon. And the army he is to conquer with his 300 men looks so vast. No wonder God, without Gideon asking him, begins to encourage him with a sign. No wonder the flames licked up and consumed the sacrifice. No wonder that the dew fell on the ground and not the fleece, and then the fleece and not the ground. No wonder. Judges chapter 7 verses 9 through 11. During the night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down to the camp, because I'm going to give this camp into your hands." Listen to what they're saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. Now, if you like me, you're going to say, they better be saying something, sure enough. If I'm going to have to go and fight all those dudes, they better be shaking in their boots. So Gideon and his servant went down into the camp. They secretly took their place by one of the tents, and suddenly they heard that soldier relating his dream. Chapter 7, verse 13, "I had a dream, a round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midian camp, and it struck the tents with such a force that the tents all overturned and collapsed. The second that his friend heard the dream, he replied," in verse 14 of chapter 7, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midian and the whole camp into his hands." Woo, that's half the battle right there. What do you think Gideon felt? He says, "Is that you, Lord? You doing that? Are you doing it to more than just one?" The moment Gideon heard it, his heart leapt inside. Out of the mouth of the enemy, he had heard the confirmation of what God had already told him. And he would give the host of the Midianites into his hands. Gideon arose and carefully made his way out of the camp, up the mountain where his 300 men were waiting. No longer was there any doubt. Verse 15 of chapter 7 says, "Get up." He's talking to his men. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." With a trumpet in every hand, a pitcher and a torch hid inside in the other hand, the 300 men eased to their place at the very edge of the Midian camp. Then when Gideon gave the signal, there was a crash of 300 pitchers. There was a flash of 300 torches. There was a blast of 300 trumpets. And there was a chorus of shouts that went up in the still of the night. Verse 20 of chapter 7, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." It was shouted till it echoed across that valley. The enemy startled. They came stumbling out of their tents in the darkness. There was mass confusion. All they could see all over was the torches as they were flashing. They could hear the trumpets blowing. There was total confusion, and they started fighting each other. When morning had dawned in that valley, it was strewn with the wreckage of that invading army. Clear to the fords of Jordan, it said, and even across the Jordan. Gideon said, "Come on, men." 300 men chasing all of them. Let me tell you something. When God's on your side, the enemy is already defeated. He has no prayer. God will so confuse the enemy that they'll turn on each other. And God will give a great victory. Some of you are facing some tough stuff. Some of you have a battle that you're in the middle of. Some of you don't know what the end is going to look like. Can I just encourage you that if you didn't have what it takes, God wouldn't present it to you. God knows that you can be victorious. And He knows that if you'll walk with Him, He'll lead you all the way through. You have nothing to worry about. He is in charge. And the enemy will kill themselves. Seriously. God is never late. He's always on time. I used to love on Saturday mornings to watch Ren 1010. Anybody remember Ren 1010? Oh, yeah. I noticed most of you are on the north side of 52. The bad guys, no matter who it was, they'd have the upper hand. And it looked like all was lost. And all of us kids sitting in front of that one, we only had one television in our whole neighborhood. Every kid in the neighborhood on Saturday would go to the Davis's house. And we'd sit there and we'd watch. And Ren 1010 would come on. And there'd be that moment when everything looked lost. And then you would hear, yo, Rennie! And the dog would jump over. Every kid in the house would jump up and say, ah! You had to be there. It was a moment thing. Because we knew that they were winning because Ren 1010 was there. Ren 1010 was a dog, in case you didn't know. And we dressed up to go in front of that television set. Man, I had my Roy Roger pistols on. Had to have two, one on each side, because Roy had them. And I had to tie them to the leg. You didn't want them flapping all over the place. Had to have my hat. I might still be in my pajamas, but I had my hat and my guns. We were sitting there, only TV in our neighborhood now. Seriously. We were sitting there one Saturday morning, and Roy Rogers was on, and he got in a fight and lost both guns. And the bad guy got the drop on him. And Roy didn't have a gun. So Lee, he was kind of small and dumb. He jumps up and grabs one of his pistols. And he says, "Here, Roy, use mine." There was a we don't know how that ended, because it was black and stinky for us. And then Miss Davis walked in, and it got kind of hot. She whipped every kid in the room. "I didn't do it. Your son, Lee, did it." "You should have stopped him." Wham, 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 wham. "Now get home." Gideon said, "Come on, guys. We're going. We're going to chase these dudes out of our country. We're not going to let them stick around." Listen, when God's given you the victory, run the enemy out of your camp, out of your home, away from your life. Get victory. Get the place cleaned. Get your children free. Get your husband, your wife free. Run the enemy totally out of the country. God has given us the victory. And they started chasing them. And they chased them across Jordan. And I'll have to finish later because there's 2 more points. So maybe not next week, but the week after next, we'll get back to that. You know how I know that we've got victory? Because we've got this sitting right here. This symbolizes our victory. If the board members and the new board members would